Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you guys with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Thursday, everybody. First up, yesterday we discussed the shake-up in Beijing with the announcement of a new super regulator. This is a very dry topic, but incredibly important for anyone following China, as it touches on the financial system, the wider economy, and elite politics. The super regulator we discussed yesterday is part of a wider set of reforms for the state council institutions intended to centralize and streamline regulatory authority over the financial system. Previously, many regulator functions were spread over several departments and bodies in Beijing. According to state media, the reforms aim to, quote, deepen institutional reform in key areas to make the leadership of the CPC over socialist modernization more sound in institutional setup, optimized in functional allocation, refined in institutional mechanisms, and more efficient in operational management. End quote. There are other concerns driving the reform too. State-run Xinhua writes that, quote, science and technology innovation lies at the heart of China's modernization drive and must be supported by a sound system. In the face of international science and technology competition and external containment and suppression, it has become even more urgent for the country to straighten out its science, technology leadership and administration system so as to better coordinate forces to make breakthroughs in core technologies and accelerate the realization of greater self-reliance and strength in the field. End quote. It's been 2 days since the announcements of the reforms. Let's take a look at some of the initial thoughts from analysts. Chinese financial media outlet Caixin writes yesterday that the new regulatory body will be set up directly under the State Council. Analysts with ANZ Bank and CITIC Securities Co. Limited, in a piece published yesterday, argue that Beijing is shifting its financial regulatory system to a so-called Twin Peaks model, similar to that adopted in countries including the UK and Australia. Quote, the Twin Peaks model divides financial oversight between two specialist regulators, one responsible for maintaining the stability of the financial system and prudential regulation of financial institutions, with the other responsible for oversight of market conduct and consumer protection, including the conduct of financial services firms. End quote. US bank Goldman Sachs writes that the new financial regulator will be given a lot of power in order to attack China's big systemic financial challenges which regular China Update viewers will be all too familiar with. Quote, we see the proposals as a consolidation of financial regulators to strengthen institutional supervision, the supervision of behaviors, and the supervision of functions. We expect more measures on liquidity and capital to prevent regulatory arbitrage by these financial conglomerates. End quote. Bloomberg's analysts write today that under the shake-up, as they call it, quote, some officials at the new authority, which will absorb the China Banking and Insurance Regulatory Commission and the Securities Regulator, could face pay cuts of more than 50%. End quote. For reference, the outlet points out that some junior employees with the China Securities Regulatory Commission currently make around 20,000 yuan a month, approximately $2,900 a month, with all benefits included. That will likely drop to below 10,000 yuan, argues Bloomberg, based on information from unnamed sources. This is a very low salary for employees at what will be China's most powerful financial regulator. Next up, US-China developments, and is China destined to become the next Japan? Hey guys, if you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to hit that like button, and as always, anyone who can go that extra mile and help keep the channel sustainable, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. Thank you so much everybody for the ongoing support. Let's continue with the episode. Yesterday was quite a heavy episode on the US-China front. We still have several updates on US-China developments from this week to cover, but it should be a little lighter than threats of war like we saw yesterday. A piece of positive news. US-based New York Times writes that the Biden administration is planning to end, this Friday, a requirement that travelers coming from China present a negative COVID-19 test before entering the United States. We remember that the US joined a whole bunch of countries, from Japan to Italy, in restricting travelers coming from the PRC earlier this year. as China opened up, and this was primarily out of fear of new variants, as well as concern towards limited transparency from Beijing. Now that China's first wave has passed, and to date no new concerning variants have been found, many countries are unwinding these restrictions. Many in the bilateral business community are now hoping for greater normalization of cross-border travel between the US and China. Another piece of promising news, it looks like US Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo will be traveling to Beijing to hold talks with her Chinese counterparts. Yesterday, China's Commerce Ministry said at a press conference that China, quote, is open to Raimondo's wish to visit, end quote. Raimondo had previously told US media in an interview that she hoped to travel to China this Northern Hemisphere spring. Meanwhile, in an exclusive, US-based Axios writes yesterday that Senator Josh Hawley, in a letter to the US Treasury Secretary, disclosed accusations from a TikTok whistleblower. We will briefly touch on these accusations, but for our purposes, what is important about this development is that it will likely be used as political ammunition to push for a TikTok ban in the US and perhaps other countries too. The whistleblower's accusations, the outlet writes, quote, suggest that TikTok overstates its separation from its China-based owner ByteDance, relies on proprietary Chinese software that could have backdoors, and uses tools that allow employees to easily toggle between US and Chinese user data. End quote. Okay, one last development on China-US relations. We have a new Gallup poll on Americans' attitudes towards China. And unsurprisingly, they are not positive. The Washington, D.C.-based analytics and advisory company writes in a new survey report published this week that for the third year in a row, Americans are most likely to mention China as the United States' greatest enemy in the world today. When asked the open-ended question, 50% of Americans say China is their nation's greatest enemy, with most of the rest, 32%, naming Russia. North Korea, which was viewed as the greatest enemy in 2018, is now a distant third at 7%. These results are from Gallup's February 1st through 23rd so-called World Affairs Survey. The Gallup survey also shows that there exist partisan differences in these perceptions. The report writes that Democrats are most likely to cite Russia as the nation's greatest enemy, with 53% doing so. On the other hand, the vast majority of Republicans, 76%, cite China as the nation's greatest adversary. China has been the overwhelming choice of Republicans each of the past 3 years, mentioned by at least 70%. Okay, next up, we are now past most of the important announcements from the 2 sessions meetings being held in Beijing. This week, 2 respected Western voices on China's economy have published articles on their observations on China's economic outlook. To end today's video, I wanted to examine some of these comments. The first piece is more positive, the second, not so much. The first piece is from Peking University's Michael Pettis, who regular viewers know I like to quote a lot. These are comments from a piece he published earlier this week. Quote, if consumption growth is strong, as I expect it to be, China should be able to achieve a GDP growth rate of closer to 6% than 5%. More importantly, much of this growth will be driven by consumption and business investment, which comprises the high-quality component of Chinese growth. That means, among other things, growth can be accomplished with a minimum increase in China's debt-to-GDP ratio. The initial trade numbers for January and February, however, were not very promising. Exports were down 6.8%, less than expected, while imports were down a whopping 10.2%, far more than expected. The result is the largest January-February trade surplus in Chinese history. For all the talk of boosting consumption, Beijing, and especially local governments, still find it much easier to respond to economic worries with supply-side policies than with demand-side policies, even when the problem is clearly on the demand side. As a result, I expect China's manufacturing to become even more globally competitive in 2023, end quote. He concludes, however, that a lot of this optimism is for this year only, and that as the country moves into 2024, many of the old issues pulling on growth and pushing up debt will return with a vengeance. The second piece we're going to examine is from George Magnus, Research Associate at the China Center at Oxford University and former Chief Economist at UBS Investment Bank. Magnus published a piece this week called "Is China Turning Japanese?" Here are just a few extracts from the piece, and I would recommend to anyone interested in this topic to give the entire article a read. Quote, "Japan especially had carved out its place in the sun as an economic powerhouse through a high savings, high investment economic development model, in which the role of consumption was restrained, and credit creation, non-productive investment, especially in real estate, and net exports were the big drivers of macroeconomic success. The share of consumption in the economy never got much over 52%, while in the 6 years to 1991, the share of investment driven by property rose by 6 percentage points to 36%. After the financial crisis, this all began to sound very familiar to China watchers. The Japan that stalked the global economy in the 1980s and that finally succumbed to the bursting of its own bubble in 1990 offers a useful, if not quite exact, template for contemporary China, which also features a high-saving, high-investment growth model. Actually, China's savings and investment shares of GDP are considerably higher than they were in Japan, and China's household consumption share is much lower at about 40%, plus or minus. I always draw people's attention to the fact that while China has income per head like Mexico, it has consumption per head that is no higher than that of Peru, nor numerous countries in sub-Saharan Africa, whatever the wow factor might be in Shanghai, Shenzhen, and other Tier 1 cities. Chronic overinvestment and misallocation of capital, both in Japan then and China now, are also associated with growing problems in the banking system. In China's case, it is proportionally a far bigger problem. Its financial system assets are estimated to amount to about 4 times GDP, while in Japan, at the peak in 1990, financial system assets were a mere 2.5 times GDP. China has some advantages over Japan, such as a state-owned financial system that can prevent significant banks from falling and a closed capital account that can protect the country's banking system and the economy from the risk of significant capital flight. This, however, might not prevent China from taking the same economic trajectory Japan has." End quote. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much everybody for watching. I will see you all tomorrow.